Okay, we come now to the Republic. Probably not Plato's most widely read dialogue, especially if you only consider it widely read if a lot of people read all of it. The Republic is rarely read in its entirety, I think. I'm not assigning all of it or even half of it. And that's fairly common. If you do a class just on Plato, you might read all of the Republic, but even then you might not. I took a class in Plato in grad school once, just on Plato, and we didn't read all of the Republic. We weren't assigned to read all of the Republic. It's a long work. It's, I believe, not his longest. I believe the Laws is slightly longer, but even if that's not true, it is still a long work. The title is somewhat misleading as well. The title, The Republic, is not the title Plato gave to it, and you know that because the word republic isn't even a Greek word. It's a Latin word, or it comes from the Latin term res publica. This is a later translation of the Republic by, in particular, Roman translators. And the translation is not particularly good. The Greek word that would have been the title of this work is politeia. And politeia just comes from the Greek word polis, or city-state, really just city. It's where we get the word politics. And politeia would have been closer to the Latin word civitas, which is where we get civic, civil, citizen, words like that. Republic has a very different meaning in Latin than politeia did in Greek. Or it has potentially different meanings. Maybe that's the best way to say it. But despite that, the Republic is the name that we've known it as, this dialogue as, for thousands of years at this point. And we'll continue on with it. In another way, the Republic is kind of a complicated dialogue in that a lot of scholars believe it was written at two different times. So a lot of scholars believe that Book 1 of the Republic, which I have not assigned you to read, was actually written early in Plato's career. It reads a lot like a lot of the early dialogues. It has the back and forth question and answer Socratic method kind of style and structure. And the rest of the dialogue from Book 2 on does not. And from Book 2 on, you have a slightly different subject or a different question that's being answered. And because of that, we're starting with Book 2. Also, the arguments in Book 1, both the arguments made by the person Socrates is talking to for most of Book 1, Thrasymachus, and the arguments made by Socrates himself just aren't particularly good. Especially the arguments made by Socrates are fairly weak. But the arguments made by Socrates in the Republic are significantly better. However, the Republic, except for a few points, is not really a dialogue in any meaningful sense. In Book 2, there are extended speeches by people other than Socrates, by characters Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are actually Plato's brothers in real life. And then Socrates responds to them. And from that point on, from the point after Glaucon and Adeimantus's long speeches end, not even really long speeches, just a few pages long in each case, it's really the Socrates show from there on out. Socrates speaks at length. This is Socrates delivering a lesson, not engaging in a question and answer session, not engaging in the Socratic method in any recognizable sense. That said, you get in the Republic, in a much fuller way than you do even in the Protagoras, a worked out theory of ethics. You also get lots of other things besides. Part of the reason this dialogue is so famous is that you also get Plato's views on political philosophy. You get Plato's views on poetry and art. You get Plato's views, especially in the middle period, on epistemology and metaphysics, so the science of knowledge and the study of what is fundamentally exists in the universe. You get all of it. You also get what is almost certainly the most famous passage Plato ever wrote, the allegory of the cave. There's a lot of stuff in the Republic. we're focusing in this class on the ethical theory. And so while I have assigned a sizable portion of the Republic, I've assigned, I believe, less than a third of it. Because there are extended parts that are purely focusing on, poetry, like Plato kind of line edits famous Greek poetry at certain points of the Republic. There are parts that are purely political philosophy, and there are some parts that are purely epistemology and metaphysics, which we're not going to focus on in this course. We're going to focus on, as much as possible, as much as it can be separated out, which is not something that's very easy to do with this book. As much as it can be separated out, though, we're going to focus on the ethical doctrines, the ethical views expressed by Socrates in the Republic. And like I said, we're starting with Book 2. And we're starting with Book 2 because we get a challenge from Glaucon. So basically what happens in Book 1 is that Socrates asks, the whole dialogue starts with actually Socrates being effectively kidnapped. A guy named Polemarchus comes upon him, or Polemachus, rather, comes up upon him and says, "Hey, I want you to come talk to my dad. My dad wants to talk to you." And Socrates says, "No, I don't want to go talk to your dad." And Polemachus says, "Well, I've got a bunch of slaves with me, and we'll make you go if you don't choose to go on your own. Like, we'll physically pick you up and take you there, old man." And so Socrates is like, "Oh, I guess." And he goes to Polemachus' father's house. There's an old man named Cephalus, and he basically asks Cephalus, like, what's getting really old like? Like, at this point, Socrates is older than Polemachus, but younger, clearly, than Cephalus. And Cephalus basically says, I don't really want things very much anymore, and that's good because when I was young, my desires used to make me do all sorts of really bad things. And it's clear he means here, in particular, sexual desires, but also desires for money and things like that. And now I don't do that anymore, so I can afford to give a bunch of money to temples to make up for all the bad stuff I did when I was a kid. And this starts a dialogue or a discussion on justice. And it, in particular, involves Socrates in a discussion with a guy named Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is a sophist. He was apparently a real guy. And Thrasymachus' position is never well stated. Sometimes it sounds like he's saying justice is an illusion. There's no such thing as justice. Sometimes it sounds like he's giving an account of what justice is. Justice is whatever benefits the powerful. But sometimes he sounds like he's saying justice is just an idea that the powerful use to manipulate the weak. Thrasymachus' position is never stated very clearly. Socrates' arguments against it aren't particularly interesting or effective. But when we get to Book 2, after Socrates has basically tied Thrasymachus in knots, Plato has his brother Glaucon offer a challenge. Basically, Glaucon says what I think most readers think. But by the time Book 1 is done, this was not convincing. What you said to Thrasymachus did not convince us on the key point that we wanted defended. And that key point that Glaucon wants defended is that justice is a good thing. So his challenge or his question is, what makes justice good? And it's very clear that as the question that Glaucon sort of expands upon gets developed, that what he means is, what makes justice good for the just person? Another way of asking this is, why should we be just? And remember that justice is one of those other regarding virtues, one of those virtues that makes you treat other people well. And so it was, in the Protagoras, one of the more theoretically troubling virtues for Socrates. And that's why Socrates defended the unity of the virtues. The idea was, well, it's kind of clear why you'd want to be temperate and brave, and even wise. But it's not always clear why you'd want to be just. And so what Socrates does in the Protagoras is just say, well, The unity of the virtues is true. All the virtues are really the same thing. So if you want to get the self-regarding ones, the ones that make you effective at like a broad range of things, then you're going to have to be just too. In the process of the Protagoras, though, Plato has Socrates, defend two doctrines, which I told you Plato himself would, even at the time potentially, the time he was writing the Protagoras, rejected, but he definitely rejected by the time he got to writing the Republic. And those are hedonism and the view that weakness of the will is impossible. Plato is going to disagree with those significantly, harshly in some ways, in the Republic. And so the account in the Protagoras that you could give on Socrates' behalf, that you could base on what Socrates says in the Protagoras of why you should be just, is not going to work because the justification that Socrates gave for the unity of the virtues, which is that the virtues are all just different names for the same basic ability, and that ability is to effectively pursue your own pleasure over the course of your whole life, right? It's a kind of practical wisdom. It's a skill or a craft that the possessor of virtue, that allows the possessor of virtue to effectively make a good life for themselves, right? A pleasurable life. There's an answer to Glaucon's question in the Protagoras. The problem is Plato doesn't think it's true. He doesn't think the enlightened self-interest tied to hedonism is going to be the way to defend the goodness of justice. And so the Republic you can think of as a way for Plato to answer the same question he effectively already answered once in the Protagoras, but answered it in a way that he actually believes. And in order to push this challenge, Glaucon divides goods up into three categories. And the three categories of goods, three kinds of goods, are instrumental goods. And remember that instrumental goods are goods that you are only good because of what they get you. So he gives as an example like physical training, exercise. You only exercise so that you can get stronger and healthier. You want to be stronger and healthier. You don't actually want to exercise on its own, but because you know exercise leads to you getting stronger and healthier, you do it. It's a merely instrumental good. Then there are two kinds of intrinsic good. Right? There are intrinsic goods. And remember, those are things you want for their own sake. Or really, to use some of the terminology I developed or presented to you in an earlier video, final goods, right? Things you want for their own sake. And for their effects. And final goods, right? I should rewrite that. Final goods, I should say, that are also instrumental. And final goods that are not instrumental. What Glaucon said is, look, there are some things you want for their own sake, but they also happen to help you get other stuff. And then there are things that you want for their own sake, but they don't help you get anything else. And Glaucon wants to know what kind of good justice is. Here's the thing, though. In the Protagoras, Plato identifies justice and all virtue as an instrumental good. You're virtuous so that you can get pleasure. But virtue is not the same thing as pleasure. Virtue is the knowledge, the practical knowledge you need in order to get more pleasure. Virtue is a merely instrumental good in the Protagoras. What Glaucon wants to know is what kind of good Socrates thinks justice is. And Socrates answers the best kind, which is this kind. It's good for its own sake, and it's good for other things it gets you. Plato is rejecting the view that virtue is a merely instrumental good. He's doing it right at the beginning of Book 2. which means he's rejecting the view of the nature of virtue as presented in the Protagoras. Now, what makes final goods that are also instrumental better than final goods that are not instrumental is actually an issue that would apparently be controversial. Aristotle is going to take the position that the best kind of good is actually the second kind, the final goods that are not also instrumental. Plato thinks that it's the final goods that are instrumental, but we'll put that aside till we get to Aristotle. So we need an account of what justice is and why it's good for people that will make it a final good, something worth pursuing for its own sake, that's also valuable in other ways. And because Glaucon believes the same thing, he believes that justice is the highest kind of good, the final good that is also instrumental, good for its own sake, but also good for what it can get you. But Glaucon agrees with that position, but he doesn't know how to defend it, and he wants Socrates to do that. So he sets him a challenge that we should compare two lives. We should compare a just person versus an unjust person. But because Glaucon doesn't really doubt the instrumental value of justice, he really wants to know about it being a final good. He really wants to know why we should think that being a just person, or a virtuous person in general, a good person, is something we should value. Right? Why should we want to be that? All on its own. Why should we value being a good person for its own sake? And so he says it's not just that we should compare a just person to an unjust person. Because after all, most unjust people are known to be unjust. And as a result, they develop a really bad reputation because other people don't like it when you're unjust. And this leads to their lives going badly. So he wants to compare not only a just person to an unjust person, but he wants to compare an unjust person who gets away with it. An unjust person who everybody believes is actually just. A criminal who everyone believes doesn't commit crimes. Right? A liar who everyone believes is honest. Versus a just person with a bad reputation. Right? Most just people, Glaucon believes, get a good reputation for being just. Right? They get a good reputation for being honest, for looking out for the interests of other people, for treating people fairly. And as a result, they prosper. Right? If you get a reputation for honesty, people are more likely to trust you, which means they're more likely to involve you in ventures that are potentially profitable. Right? If you want a business partner and you got to choose between the liar and the honest person, you're going to choose the honest person because you're more likely to benefit from that relationship. But that means honest people are more likely to benefit than known liars. So Glaucon says we want to get around that. We want to isolate the justice itself. So we don't want to consider its instrumental value. We want to consider a person who is just, who does the right thing, but who never gets credit for it. In fact, who is thought to be unjust, versus an unjust person who gets away with it. And he uses the example of Gyges, who was a sheep herder who finds a ring that turns him invisible, Lord of the Rings style. And Gyges goes on to murder the local king and take the queen as his wife, to force the queen to become his wife. Clearly unjust behaviors, but because he can get away with it, because no one knows he killed the king, right? Because he did it with the ring of invisibility on, he gets away with it. Glaucon says, give me some reason why we shouldn't all do that if we find a magic ring that turns you invisible. Then Glaucon's brother Adeimantus claims that he's going to add to the challenge, but he doesn't really add anything of substance. And so this is the challenge that Socrates has to meet in this book. He has to prove that being a just person is worthwhile for its own sake, even if it doesn't get you the normal benefits. And interestingly, Glaucon presents an alternative theory about what justice is, where it comes from, and why people are usually just, that is tied very closely, or at least somewhat closely, to some of the ideas that popped up in the Crito. Although with at least one very important difference. Glaucon claims that justice is a convention. He says, because everyone knows it's worse to suffer injustice than to commit injustice, right? It's worse to be the victim of lying, of stealing, and things like that, than it is to successfully get away with lying and stealing, right? Because, you steal something, you've got, somebody's stuff for a little while, and it's nice. But if you're the victim of theft, it can completely upend your life, right? Because everyone wants to avoid being the victim of theft, lies, assault, more than they want to commit them, people get together and they agree that they're going to impose punishments on injustice and rewards for justice. Right? And that's really where justice comes from. There's a certain class of behaviors that people want to promote and a certain class of behaviors that people want to condemn, right? So that they're less likely. That really what virtue is on this account is a social agreement that's designed to provide certain incentives to people. This view fits really well with what's in the Protagoras, right? If justice is just the kinds of actions you engage in to get social approbation from other people, that fits really well with the idea that justice is a way to get pleasure, right? It also kind of fits with the idea that Socrates owes the city of Athens his obedience because of an agreement. Because what is a convention other than an agreement? So you might think, well, what's wrong with this theory? This seems to fit well with things that Socrates thought. It fits well with the theory in the Protagoras. It might fit well with the view of the duty to obey the law in the Crito, although I think that's actually a little less clear. But it certainly fits well with the Protagoras. So what's the problem with it? Well, the problem with it is that if justice is the result of a convention, Plato's going to say it's not real, right? It's something we made up. It's a fiction. It's just a different name we've given to stuff we don't want people to do. But that's not the same thing as it being genuinely good for its own sake, right? Justice is good and injustice is bad just because we've agreed to it, because it makes society work a little easier. It fits really well with the social contract theory, which I've mentioned before. But Plato doesn't like that, because that makes the virtues only good because we've agreed that they're good. And Plato doesn't like basing moral truths on conventions between people, on agreements between people. And you can think of there being two reasons for that, right? One is that it seems like it makes them kind of fictional, right? Not real. It only exists as long as we all pretend we exist. It's like money, right? I actually got my wallet, so I can pull out some cash, right? Here's all the cash that was in my wallet, $2 bills. Right? I can use this to buy a bottle of Coke. Right? Why can I buy a bottle of Coke with this? Well, I can buy a bottle of Coke with this because we've all agreed to treat these little green pieces of paper as valuable. But if that agreement ever breaks down, this paper has close to no value. Its value would be exhausted entirely in its ability to serve as, like a tissue or kindling for a fire. It has very little function, very little value. Its value depends on what people think. It doesn't have any value in itself. And that's one problem, right? If justice is just a convention, then justice has no value in itself. Another problem is, if it's just a convention, if it's just conventional, then we can imagine different conventions in different places, right? Saying that justice or morality is just conventional, right? A view that's sometimes called conventionalism. Conventionalism is the view that moral truth depends on agreements between people to incentivize certain behaviors and prohibit other behaviors. Conventionalism leads very quickly to relativism. Why? Because different groups of people could decide on different conventions. So, for example, I think it's wrong to buy and sell other human beings. I think it would be wrong, for example, for me to sell my daughters once they're old enough to some man for them to marry. A conventionalist about morality would say, well, that's true. It's just because we've gotten together and decided it's true. But what if we run into a different society that has gotten together and they've decided a different way? They've decided that no, parents can sell their children. It's part of how we build wealth. It's part of how we maintain coherent family structures, right? Let's say you're imagining a society where men own all the wealth, men pass their wealth down to their sons, and only their sons, and maybe only their oldest son. Well, then what's the function of daughters in such a society? Well, the function of daughters is to be sold to increase the wealth that can be passed from father to son. Suppose we ran into a society like that, an extreme patriarchal society. I'd be tempted to say that society does things wrong, right? That is a bad set of values. That's a bad way to structure your society. You shouldn't do it. But if morality is in the end just conventional, and they have different conventions, then isn't it true for them that buying and selling people is right, while it's false for us? But if that's the case, if one thing can be true in morality for one group, but false for another, then you've just adopted relativism, moral relativism. Moral conventionalism leads very quickly to moral relativism. The only way to avoid it is if you have a convention that everyone is a party to, right? If you say that every human being has and always will agree to these conventions, which is a very difficult claim to make, although we'll see towards the end of the course we'll run into a theorist who will make that claim, or a similar claim at least. Plato, one of the unifying themes across all of Plato's work is Plato hates relativism. He hates relativism in every guise it shows up in his work. He opposes it all the time. And so, given that conventionalism seems to lead to relativism, that's another reason to reject conventionalism, which means it's a reason to reject the idea that justice is the content of justice, the nature of justice, is determined by conventions, which means that there's extra pressure now to get rid of the view in the Protagoras. Because the reason why you would be just, according to this conventional theory, is being just gets you the approval of other people in your society, which is something you need if you want to pursue a pleasant life. So we already see in Book 2 of the Republic the rejection of the account of virtue in the Protagoras in favor of an account of virtue that is not conventional, right, and in which justice and virtue are good for their own sakes. And that account is one that I'll get to, or get started on at least, in